say that I am very happy to introduce our speaker for tonight. Her name is Danielle C. Miles, and she has graciously offered to give us her program entitled Avian Acoustic Monitoring in the Northern Great Basin. She's working towards her PhD at the University of Nevada in Reno in the Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology department. And we are so grateful that she has given us some of her time. She's a busy person, being an educator, a researcher, and a scientist, and she's here with us tonight. We will be benefiting from her 4 years experience studying the Great Northern Basin sagebrush habitat and the impact that pinyon juniper woodland removal has had on the birds, reptiles, and other small mammals. I know that I, for one, am looking forward to learning about her novel acoustic research methods. And I thank you so much for taking us under your wings and sharing with us your knowledge tonight. And with that, I want you to please welcome Danielle Miles.
Thank you very much. You should be able to see the slideshow now. So I did want to expand upon that introduction just a little bit to say that this is my PhD work that is just now finishing up. I hope to be officially defending sometime in the summer here, but I was able to move to Northern Nevada in August of 2016 and start this project. And so I was coming from Michigan State from a forestry and a zoology background, and then applying those skills in these new ways in what are conifer woodlands in the Northern Great Basin. And I know that all of us are in different areas, so I want to first get us oriented to the habitats that I study in the Northern Great Basin. So come take a walk with me. Let's imagine that we are in a pinyon and juniper woodland. So this is a dense conifer area where you have single-leaf pinyon pine and western junipers. And then the closer you get over towards Quincy and the western part of the Nevada Northern Great Basin, you get just conifers that are dominated by western juniper rather than that mix. But you'll hear me say them both together as PJ or pinyon and juniper. And so while we're in this conifer woodland, imagine what you would hear. What kind of birds do you hear singing? What kind of other animals might be making noise? As the sun starts to set, how would that acoustic landscape change? What would you be hearing as it gets completely dark? Similarly, let's walk away from the woodlands and let's start to get into more of a mixed habitat where you have a sagebrush understory. So you have a few feet height of your big sagebrush, and then a few interspersed trees. So you might have some predators who are able to use that as roosting sites. You might be able to still see some of those same songbirds you did in the conifer woodlands. How would the landscape of your sound change? Further, what if you go to an area where those trees have been removed? So across the Northern Great Basin, wildlife and land management agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service have been removing pinyon and juniper trees to restore sagebrush habitat is the goal. But you have these habitats like this rock fen is using, where you have trees that are now covering the ground. So you have some interspersed sagebrush, but you have a large amount of tree litter. I just realized, hopefully that little screenshot went away. Sorry, there was a little mark on my screen. So now that we have these different ecosystems in mind, what we might be hearing at them, we should think about how these ecosystems are changing in the Great Basin. So this figure here is the whole outline of what's considered the Great Basin, and it's a Great Basin because water does not drain to the ocean. All of the water evaporates. Right? So it's either going to go into smaller bodies of water and then stay there, or evaporate and fall back down as rain. It never makes it to the ocean. And so these are dry habitats. And with climate change, we're seeing that the vegetation continues to change and adapt to these new temperatures and less snow availability and snow melt in the early spring, so less water overall. Additionally, the Great Basin is threatened by invasive plant species such as cheatgrass that are taking over areas that should be sagebrush. So the sagebrush is experiencing what some people call the great squeeze, where you have some of these conifers, the junipers and the pinyon pines that are moving down off of some of the higher parts of the mountain slope. And then you have invasive species. So that whole sagebrush area is being squeezed and there's less and less habitat. And so this is going to have effect on certain species that are reliant on sagebrush. And one of those is the greater sage-grouse. And so the greater sage-grouse has been in continual decline for as long as we've been studying it. So nearly a century now, we've been seeing continual declines and loss of the greater sage-grouse. If you look at this map here of their range, which includes most of the northern Great Basin, the darker shaded green are areas where we still can find sage-grouse, and then the lighter shaded green are areas where they used to be 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, and they are no longer, right? So these habitats are changing, and this is going to affect what birds are able to live there. One of the things that's unique about the sage-grouse is that sagebrush is actually toxic, and the greater sage-grouse is actually able to consume it without being poisoned. And so they're one of the few species who have adapted to do this, and the pygmy rabbit is another one. But during the winter, when most of the low-growing plants are covered with snow, they can have their diet all the way up to 100% based off of the sagebrush. And so this is a critical ecosystem for them. And so one of the ways that wildlife and land managers are hoping to increase the greater sage-grouse populations is to remove pinyon and juniper trees. Because the greater sage-grouse want just strictly sagebrush habitat. They don't want any of those interspersed trees because, like we said, there could be predators there. There could be some of the larger species like owls and the like who could predate on their young, and then of course crows who could be predating on their eggs, right? So they avoid these tree habitats. They want it to be completely treeless. And so that's where we can think about how removing expansion and dealing with that can have a potential benefit for the greater sage-grouse. So here we have, this is out in Ely on the very far east part of the Nevada Northern Great Basin. And so here you have the mountainsides, and you see where the trees over the last few centuries to thousands of years are really dominant. And then you have this area closer up on the picture where you have this low growing sagebrush, right? So this is what's going to be called an ecotone because it's the transitional period between two different habitat types. So you have your dominant tree cover where there is not a sagebrush understory, and then you have your sagebrush areas where there are no trees, and then this is an ecotone as a transition. And so the idea is as these trees move into sagebrush habitat and then outcompete the sagebrush, that we can remove these smaller trees, which I've circled here in red, and then kind of space out this area so that sagebrush can be more dominant, can be restored. And so the idea here is with an increase in pinyon and juniper trees, there's a decrease in sagebrush habitat. And so this is where I'm going to start to ask for your interaction. What do we think is going to happen to this sage-grouse in these situations?
They stop breeding.
Okay, so they're going to spend less time here, right? The leks are potentially going to move, and they're not going to be breeding here. The populations here will decrease. Perfect. So then we have removal. So this is what a pinyon and juniper removal site looks like. So this is our standard way of removing pinyon and juniper trees, which is referred to as lop and drop or lop and scatter. I see that someone put in the chat that their ranges will shift. Okay, and so that is true, right? They are able to move their bird, they can disperse, and so they do move away from these treed habitats where they start to be denser canopy cover. But remember this idea of the great squeeze, there's only so many areas where you can move. So then you have land management agencies who are removing these trees to hopefully then restore the sagebrush. So you can see all of the dead tree litter on the ground. So we have a novel habitat type, this removal site, but the idea is that this low growing sagebrush will then recover, right? And it can be the dominant habitat here. And there's only one large tree in this area. So hopefully this habitat's now more open for the greater sage-grouse. So again, we see a decrease in trees, an increase in sagebrush habitat. And so this one should be easy. What should be our expected sage-grouse response? Anyone can
Population increase.
Right, the population should increase. Hopefully these birds will start to use this habitat. That's the overall goal. And that we see that there will be an increase in their populations. And so we've been doing this type of management on the scale of thousands of acres across the Western United States. And so depending on where you are, again, those dominant trees are going to be different, but they're targeting conifer woodlands, mostly dominated by junipers. And so we don't know yet what the actual effects of this will be for other species. The greater sage-grouse is one that is of huge concern because people do not want it to make it onto the endangered species list, because that would change the way that we have to manage some of these lands. But that's one of hundreds of species that live in the northern Great Basin and the Great Basin west overall. And so we don't know what the effect of these tree removals will be on other species that are using this habitat. So go back to thinking about you're standing in a woodland and what birds and animals you might hear. Those animals now, as sage-grouse move into this new sagebrush habitat, those animals will also likely have to disperse to the habitats that they prefer. So there's going to be a trade-off here, and we just don't know yet what that trade-off is. And so it's critical that we learn and understand how populations and communities of animals respond to these vegetation changes, this change in dominant species. And so that's really the way to assess if this management intervention is a success overall. Right? So the target is the sage-grouse, but we don't know overall what the effect is. And so that's what I've been trying to do over the last 4 years of this PhD, is to actually quantify what species are using these treatment habitats and which species are using the undisturbed habitats neighboring the removal sites. And so across the 5 regions that I have been studying in the Northern Great Basin, we see actually 3 different types of treatments. That lop and scatter, like in the previous picture, is the most dominant. And so you can see that here, this is Horse Creek out by Little Sheldon in Northern Washoe County, that you have these trees on the ground, right? And that's our typical. Mastication is a little more expensive for the land management agencies, but you don't have this thick litter that can impede movement for some species, and you hope to have a quicker restoration. So mastication is essentially mulching the trees. And so that's why it's a little more expensive, because you have that extra step to mulch and spread the mulch of the trees. And then the most controversial of the types of tree removal is chaining. And this is literally where you have old military battle chains, and they're drug across the landscape by bulldozers, right? And so it clears all of the vegetation. And so most of these projects that are chaining are put under the umbrella of fuels reduction and fire risk reduction, rather than sage-grouse, because all of the vegetation gets destroyed, and these habitats have to start anew. So the different management agencies take this on differently, but overall this is all going to be called sagebrush treatment or pinyon juniper treatment, conifer removals, and you'll hear those words. And so before this project started, we did make some predictions of what types of species might benefit and which types of species might be negatively affected by tree removal. And so some of the bat species that potentially are going to have a positive effect are the pallid bat and the fringed myotis, because they do best foraging in large open spaces, or that's what we think about them from other parts of the range. Nevada overall is very understudied. Then some bats that potentially are going to have a decline in use of those habitats or their population are the Townsend big-eared bat and the hoary bat, because they're going to be roosting in these trees. So if you remove the roost sites, similar to if you remove sagebrush habitat for the sage-grouse, you're going to have a loss in breeding and their populations decline overall. Some of the birds that we predicted might have a positive impact from these tree removals with an expansion of nesting sites into the sagebrush restoration areas are the green-tailed towhee and the brewer sparrow and the sagebrush sparrow, right? Things that are reliant on sagebrush habitats. Unlike the pinyon jay and the loggerhead shrike, who are much more found in these open woodland habitats dominated with tree cover. And so you can see that there's some other species on here, small mammals and reptiles. And even though today I'm just focusing on birds and then some coyote stuff, we overall look at reptiles, small mammals, birds, bats, and then we use insects as a common food source between most of these species, right? And all those species are able to move on the landscape completely differently. Reptiles might use the same 100 meters for their entire life, where some of these birds are going to migrate and come back. And so overall with this project, our objective is to determine the effectiveness of these removal projects. And so we have 45 monitoring sites. Our 5 regions are the BLM land that's right on the border of Modoc County, California, and Northern Washoe. That's managed by the Surprise Valley Bureau of Land Management in Cedarville. Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. So both of those are going to be dominated by Western juniper and no pinyon. And then our other 3 sites are going to have a mix of pinyon and juniper. And so that's Austin, Nevada, Elko, Nevada, and Ely, Nevada. And so within each one of these, we have 9 monitoring spots that span this habitat gradient from sagebrush all the way to thick trees. And then for 2 of these sites, we're going to have removal in the ecotone area where the trees are cut down. And then we're a control site where you have this still mixed habitat without any removal. And so to look at this across all of these regions, we have to move around throughout the summer. And so we spend the entire summer moving from site to site, and we put up these recording devices. And so something that you might be familiar with is observer avoidance behavior. And so observer avoidance behavior is you go out to look at a bird, and what does it do? It flies away, right? And so one of the benefits of using passive acoustics is that you don't have to be standing there on the landscape to get a sample of what birds are there. And so these are going to be biased towards birds that do make noise, right? So preferably, between that May and July, birds that are singing and showing off that they're there. Without an observer there in the field, you can record those. And so these are made by Wildlife Acoustics. And so this right here is the bird detector. It's called an SM4. And then this microphone on top is actually a high frequency microphone that gets triggered by high frequency sound and makes a 4-second recording. And that's how we determine what bat species are present. And so we move these tripods around to each of our 45 monitoring stations to see what birds and bats are using that habitat. Similarly, you can see that same tripod out here in the distance, and this is a sagebrush area with the ecotone further back. And so during the summer, we go to each of these transects for 6 nights at a time. So there should be 18 total nights of monitoring. And when I say nights, we're out there for nights, but the recorders are recording they're recording 5 minutes at the beginning of every hour. So throughout the day, nighttime birds or morning birds, everything is getting a sample, right, over that whole week. And so these are only useful because we can actually quantify sound, and we can use sound to identify 2 species, right? We don't actually have to see the bird to be able to identify what species it is. So this is where I'm going to test you again. Does someone want to try and give a definition of sound? And I can call on one of you. I'm not afraid to do that. How about Pierce or Fate? Do you want to give a guess of what sound is?
So, sound is what you just were not getting from anybody.
Okay, Okay, the opposite.
Vibration.
Perfect.
Sound is vibration.
Vibration, thank you. Both of those, I guess, are correct. So sound is going to be the vibrations that travel through the air or another medium, right? So this could be through the ocean, this could be through the ground, and then travels to the target, right? So we're going to be using sound and communication for looking at our birds, and that's the whole reason that they're making noise, right? Is they're out there showing off, hey, come breed with me, or announcing that this is their territory. And so they are sending these vibrations out, and our recorders are able to then pick those up, right? And so the quality of your recording is going to be related to the sensitivity to those vibrations. And so then we're able to look at those on a spectrogram. And so this is just a little note here that sound waves then get translated by the receiver, right? And so that's all about what you can actually perceive in your physiology. And so you'll see things like this, where you have a few different variables related to picking up these vibrations. And so there's time, the length of the vibrations, the frequency, so how high up it is, we would, in music, you'd call that pitch. And amplitude is the strength, like how loud is it, right? And so we put all these variables together and we can look at them on a spectrogram. So I've kind of hinted at what this is, but what would you think is a definition of a spectrogram? You've got your mic off, Pearson Tate, you can go again. Let's see. Someone put out there like a heartbeat monitor. Okay, those are really simple. Less so because you're not seeing the frequency as much, but I also don't know enough about human hearts to say what that y-axis is. But same idea, over time and strength. So you have two of those variables. And so simply we could put that a spectrogram is a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies of the sound or whatever other signal it is with time, right? So we're going to have time as the x-axis and then frequency as the y-axis. So I'm going to show us some. This is, I'm still going to need your interaction here. Let me stop this share. And I'm going to pull up some test sounds for you. Test your birding ability here. Okay, so here we have a spectrogram, and you all can see it, right? And so, perfect. On the x-axis here on the bottom, you have time. So this is pretty zoomed out in, 1/10 of a second. And then on the y-axis here, this is kilohertz. So frequency is increasing on the y-axis to the point where, we can't hear it up here. We do really good at identifying sounds down here. Okay, so you tell me with your birding skills what this is. If you can't hear it, you should turn up your volume. Maybe depends on your microphone.
Chickadee.
It's a chickadee. It's a mountain chickadee.
Mountain chickadee.
Perfect.
They're doing it all over the yards right now.
Okay, that one was an easy one. Let me pull up some more here for you. What about this one? Let's zoom in again, because before we were on 0.1 of a second. Now we'll zoom in so we can see the beautiful shape of these.
One of the jays, stellar jay.
Nice. 2 for 2 there. Okay, we have a Stellar's jay. I'll give you another one. We're just going to get harder and harder here. We'll zoom in again. This is a multiple minutes, and we don't need multiple minutes. We just need to hear it once. Does someone got that one?
Tanager?
Yeah, it's a Western tanager. Perfect. Okay,
All
Let's
right, Dawn.
Lucky.
Okay. Let's get one step harder here. Tried to pick ones that should be overlapping in our regions though. So this one's got a nice shape too. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
Not to me. Is it going to be a sparrow?
No, this one's a dark-eyed junco.
Oh, didn't sound like my dark-eyed junco.
And so birds, so that's the other thing that gets tricky about birds, unlike bats, is that they're gonna have these regional dialects, right? And they're gonna have multitudes of sounds that they can make. And so, but we use these spectrograms to then be able to identify what birds are using these habitats, right? And so I have, or had, not now anymore, we ran out of money, a full-time person who spent their days identifying all of these recordings that we collected during the summer, right? So we're not out there actually potentially disturbing what data that we could be getting because it's passively recorded. Okay, this one's gonna be extra tricky. You have to think outside of the bird box. Okay, here. It's a weird one. What does that sound like?
Alien transmission.
Okay, alien transmission. What was somebody else's guess?
Coyotes?
Not coyotes. This is actually a bowhead whale. And so I got this sound clip from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology sound bank. And they actually sell these sounds for movies with spaceships. And so
Somebody guessed that in the chat. I think it was Liz. She said whales anyway.
oh, let me see if I can get the chat back up.
Yeah, I saw it come up.
Oh, I see it now.
Sounds like whales, and she was somebody.
Nice. Whoever said whales, you were on it. And so one thing that you can use when determining what species it is to again look at this actual the actual axes of this. And so remember, our birds were up in the higher frequencies. Now we're zoomed in at pretty low frequencies, right? So this would be just 1 kilohertz here. Some of these sounds are pretty low, but the reason that you would want to use a low frequency sound is one, you're in water, which is a thicker medium than air, but also because whales are trying to communicate over far bigger distances than your birds are. And so the lower frequency sound you get, the further that sound will travel. And then the higher frequency you get, the more accurate you can get in terms of painting a picture of your landscape like bats, but it's not going to travel very far. Okay, cool. So I'm going to stop sharing those. I do have a few more of those later, but let's stop that for now. Go back to my slideshow here. Okay, so we're out there, right, for these whole weeks, and I have someone who is identifying the birds and to species. But then we want to know, since this is a novel method for studying the Great Basin, passive acoustics have been used all over the globe, but like I said, the Great Basin and Nevada in particularly are far understudied. We wanted to know how many of these sound files do we actually need to identify to know what is the community of birds at that site. Right. So the way that you do that is if you are looking at species richness, the total number of species that are there, when do you kind of hit that plateau? So on this figure here, we have the x-axis, which is the number of 5-minute sound files. So remember, they're recording 5 minutes at the beginning of every hour. So 24 would be a full day of recording, 48, 2 days, and the like. And so we're out there for up to 6 nights. And then we have species richness here on the y-axis. And so we're looking for a trend in plateau, right? So when you have these flatter areas of each line compared to these steeper ones, that means that you're not really gaining any species, or maybe 1 or 2, by having that recorder out there longer, right? So if you had a shorter amount of monitoring, you would still get all or the majority of the birds that live there, right? So we don't need to spend all of the time out in the field and have a person spending all of their time identifying those sound files. And so overall, at one site over a full week, we had a maximum number of 49 unique bird species identified within that week. And then we had one unfortunate week at one site where only 1 bird was singing that entire time. But this is selections of subsets of those sound files to answer the question of how many sound files do we actually need to get the accurate picture of that community. And so those species accumulation curves, because they have a slope and they have this logistic trend to flatten out, you can actually mathematically predict what the total richness would be, right, over time. So you can map that relationship further. And so by taking subsets of all of our data, we did 100 samples of each different type of subset. And so then we can see what is the most optimal way to spend our time and resources, especially funding resources, for identifying birds. All of the birds in all 24 sound files of the day, looking at just a few hours in the morning and a few. We're going to identify the sound files in all 24 hours of the day. And then this line here is the probability or the capture of all species, right? And so because this is pulling from our data and it is simulation, we can actually predict more species are there than what were observed. So that's how you get into this 1.25 here. But this is the total, assuming that we get all of the species, right? And so if you were going to identify all 24 hours of the day of sound files, you really actually only need to put the acoustic recorder out there for 3 days. If you wanted to identify less sound files but spend more time in the field, you could go out there for 5 days, but then have less sound files to identify, right? So 3 times 24 is 72, but you're out in the field less. And then if you could spend more time in the field because like us, you're doing small mammal trapping or something else, then you can spend less time identifying files by just targeting those peak activity periods, right? And so those are potential subsets that can reduce the time in the field if that's your biggest cost, or the time identifying sound files if that's your biggest cost. And so if you only wanted to do mornings, you could get away with somewhere between 40 and 48 sound files, so 5 to 6 days in a full week if you wanted to do just mornings. And so overall, we didn't see a difference in the number of birds between areas where you have tree removals like this and dense trees. But the species composition, even though the raw numbers of species, pull out which birds had the strongest response to the tree removals, which birds are doing best there, and which birds are no longer found there once the tree removal happens. And so we'll be able to relate that to our actual vegetation data for change and dominant veg height and that kind of thing. But I'm not ready to give you any conclusive data on what the response is of those. But I do want to go through some of our other work. And one of these questions that an undergrad has helped me develop, a student here at UNR, is can we use these passive recordings to characterize coyote habitat use? So coyotes on the landscape are within our human hearing range, right? So we should be able to record them right on the spectrograms like we do for the birds. And so they weren't originally a target species of ours, but we get them on the recordings all the time. So we want to know, can we use this data that we already have to say something about coyote use in response to the trees? And so now I'll show you what a coyote spectrogram looks like, since that one came up. Oh no, my little document is frozen. Oh, here we go. Let me share my screen with you again. And so this is zoomed out because we have these 5-minute sound files. So let me go ahead and zoom in where we want. I'll show you this little part here, actually. This is a cow. So we get, because there is grazing across Nevada on public lands, we get all sorts of cow calls on there too. So this is the approach of coyotes, like one lone coyote kind of howling and starting. And then here we can get them going together. Can you all hear it? And then they're going to pick up here again. And so something that you'll see is that this is, again, a really low frequency sound compared to some of our birds who are high frequency up here, because the coyotes are trying to transmit that sound over wide areas of the landscape. Right? We want to say where they are based off of how far this sound can travel. So we're able to say something broader about them on the landscape than some of the birds who are only detectable right next to our recorder. Pull up the slideshow. And so the way that we would be able to find out where they are on the landscape is through triangulation. And so here, this is a sample of one of our sites out from Ely. So we have a sagebrush area, we have an area where trees have been cut, and we have our thicker woodland. And so based off of the strength of that sound, the amplitude, we can say if it's being detected on all of these recorders, where the pack is based off of the strength of the sound. But the thing that we didn't know, because we weren't intending to record coyotes and test for where they are on the landscape, is what their maximum sound is. What is the amplitude? What is the strength of their sound if they're 0 meters away, right? If they were right next to our tripod and they were in the conifer habitat or they were in the sagebrush habitat, we wouldn't know because we don't know what their maximum is. So luckily, the Lake Tahoe Wildlife Care, which is a rehab center down in South Lake Tahoe, they had temporarily housed coyotes because one of the members of their pack had been injured. And we were able to record them at different distances for 2 nights while they were in captivity there right before they got released. And so here's one of those SM4 detectors again. So the same exact ones we use in the field, but 0 meters away from the pack. So we can say what is their maximum sound. And how did that sound change over distance? And so here's a sample from one of those calls. And we see throughout those 2 days, the maximum volume of the pack got around 114 decibels. That's the maximum power that we are able to actually extract from using that program I've been showing you the spectrograms in. And so overall, coyotes in the field, we detected at further away distances because their decibels are less, the sound volume is less, compared to those at different distances in the captive scenario. So these are most likely, up to a kilometer or 2 kilometers away compared to our coyotes that were under 800 meters away from the detector. 300 meters from the detector. And so we tried to build an auto detection system within that spectrogram program, Raven, to detect coyotes in the sound files for us. But of course, there are other low frequency sounds. And so we had a lot of misses here. It takes much more time to do it manually, but it's much more accurate. And so in the middle of the day here, it's almost solely cows at that low frequency bar or crows, right? The actual coyotes, so this is number of current, all of these are positive occurrences of coyotes. You can see that we skip the middle hours of the day here, right? Coyotes are much more active at night. But using our positive detections, we've been able to use these circles to try and roughly estimate where they are rather than directly triangulating, say this is the region that they're probably in. And so we did this, I guess I'll finish up here since we're nearing the hour. We did this both with the theoretical relationship of sound over distance and using the empirical data that we have from the field of how, from the captive coyotes, of how sound changes over distance for coyotes. And with the theoretical relationship here, we actually weren't able to get locations at all, and because the range of sound wasn't big enough. But with our actual empirical data, the data that we've collected and looking at the distance by volume, we were able to, these are real data points here without the landscape satellite picture underneath of where they would be. Okay. And so you can put that on a map. And these are some of our Austin sites where if the coyotes are really loud, we can get these really small areas on the landscape where this is where the pack is. And then if they're further away from our detectors, we have these wider range of where they could be. And we can look at these over time. And so now, as these circles get darker, White Pine County is out by Ely, this is out by Elko. The more times you see that occurrence, the darker that area will be. And that's where over the weeks that we've been monitoring the area that they spend the most time. And so using these passive acoustic detectors, we've not only been able to look at birds, but we've also been able to look at coyotes over the landscape. We've been able to manually be able to detect them. We've been able to triangulate where they are on the landscape, and we can then relate that to their vegetation. I'm not going to talk about acoustic indices today since we're approaching 8 o'clock, but I will do 2 final tests of your spectrogram guessing here. I have a few more examples and then I'll just take some questions. So let me pull this up. Okay. So this is another, again, look, low frequency sound. Has to pay attention to this y-axis here. Ready? Okay, we have a guess of a mountain lion. Okay, it is a predator, but let's switch continents. Guess beyond North America. Who else got a guess? Wolf, Sasquatch. Sasquatch is also North America, so are the wolves. This is actually a spotted hyena. So the wolf there is the closest. And so again, you're talking about these big savanna areas and you want that sound to travel a far distance. So the lower the frequency, this whooping sound that they call it, can be heard at further distances. And this was a study species of mine in undergraduate. Okay, ready? now we're talking even lower frequency sound here, right? We're at 200 hertz, right? Not even 1 kilohertz. And we're still in Africa. An elephant, perfect, Stephen. And we have a guess of a lion. This is an African forest elephant. And so just like the way that we've been able to try and triangulate where the coyotes are on our landscape, we actually borrowed that idea from what is called the Elephant Listening Project. So if you Google the Elephant Listening Project, that's also from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so they've been able to actually track elephant movement and understand how many African forest elephants are out on the landscape by these really low frequency sounds that travel for kilometers through the ground, right? So they're sending the sound through the soil and it moves kilometers away. Okay, final one. We're moving back here to Nevada, the Great Basin. But this one was a struggle for us for a little bit. Does that sound like anything familiar to anyone? So our bird person had originally identified these as Virginia rails. Someone guessed here a wren. And so if you listen to Virginia rail sounds, this does sound very familiar. But the thing is, so our person who is doing the identification is blind to the habitat. So there's no bias about the tree removal. And so the thing that our bird identifier didn't know is that this is up in the talus habitat. So those rocky scree areas where you find American pika. And so all of these sound files got identified as Virginia rails. But it would be very weird for Virginia rails to be up in these high rocky areas. And so we went out there, did some playback just to make sure that it wasn't Virginia rail. But these are American pika, and this dialect, so just like birds, American pika are known to have different dialects, but we don't really know anything about the dialect in the Great Basin, because this does not sound like all of your standard pika recordings that you hear, which are mostly come from Yellowstone and the surrounding area. The pika here in the Great Basin sound very similar to Virginia rails for whatever reason, but these sounds are American pika. And so we're still using all of this data to learn more and more about
Can we hear it again, just for the fun of it, Danielle?
Yeah.
That was so neat.
And so you can imagine him on the little top of the rock calling out. And you can Google, look at YouTube videos of pika calling, and it won't sound like this. Our pika here in the Great Basin, the northwestern part of Nevada, have this really unique, more nasally dialect to them. And so overall, these new techniques are really giving us a lot of insights into what species are using different habitats in the Great Basin. And these technologies will only continue to get better in terms of auto-detecting and being able to identify them. But they do come with some risks of mis-ID, and people get ahead of themselves with auto-detection without testing them. And so the biggest takeaways I would give to people are to actually test them, right? To have a comparison, to kind of the boots on the ground approach, and going out there, making sure that the species you think it is actually what's out there calling. And so I will end it with that. Here's my thank you slide. I have a website. You're welcome to email me, reach out If you want to go through bird calls and identify them, we have thousands of sound files that we can never get to. So all the help, the better. I would like to shout out to some of my undergraduate interns who have helped with bird ID. Our main paid person who has been an amazing expert at bird identification, Richard Goldgart, and my advisor is Kevin Shoemaker at UNR. That's all I got.
Well, thank you so much.
And I can stay on for questions. I'm in no hurry.
Zoom you if anyone had any questions. I wasn't sure if you just wanted us to raise our hand or if people wanted to put them in the chat.
Shout them out, whatever you want to do.
I know that I didn't, you might have told us how large the removal area was, but I missed it. I'm trying to figure out, did you say, was it less than a mile, 5 miles?
So some of the area, it's different by goal of the project and management agency. So the actual size is a variable we will use in our overall analysis of which birds respond well and which don't. But we have projects that are 1,600 acres, a few thousand acres, and then we have sites that are just a small area with a few trees removed.
Okay.
Matt asked, are there AI programs to analyze the bird calls? That's where if we would have gotten more time in the talk, I would have talked about acoustic indices and some of these ways that people are trying to take sound and quantify it. Bird calls are tricky, and so if someone tells you that they have an AI program to identify birds, they're lying to you, and you should not buy what they're selling. But the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is kind of the leader on that, and so even with the greatest minds on it right now, they've only been able to come up with a strong auto ID for their lake outside of that building, outside of the lab. And so they know what is the set of birds that come there, and they're able to, and what their dialects are, and they're able to have an auto ID for that. But you can build your own for targets. So that's what we've tried to do with both the pika and the coyotes. But as you saw, what it really does is it picks up any amplitude within that frequency bar that you're looking at. So when we're trying to detect coyotes, we get cows and crows. And so they're not really advanced. But that's because birds are difficult, right? They change their sounds to be sexy, and they change their sounds if they're angry or if they're trying to defend. And so unlike other species that are going to use the same call over and over again.
Is complete removal of the wood never done?
So, I mean, it depends on what you mean by complete. Like for some of our sites that are, thousands of acres of a removal project, those 2,000 acres will be cleared of trees, but they don't take them off the landscape. Is
That's
that
what
you
I
mean?
meant.
Yeah. They never take the best that they'll do is they'll try and encourage people to come pick up wood. But Austin really does that a lot, and they don't really, it's not really successful.
Is that just a practical financial decision?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can get for a few bucks an acre, just the lop and drop where they cut the trees, like chain crews come through, like chainsaw crews, I mean. The mastication can run anywhere between like 80 bucks to 100 bucks an acre. Out in the Sheldon, they have done some burning where they'll cut the trees one year, let the trees dry out, pile up the trees, and then burn them the next year. But at the sites that they've done that, those trees burn so hot in those piles that you really scorch that healthy layer of soil, and you just get cheatgrass in these big weird circles on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. So I was looking at some of one of the slides. I realized there was a lot of dirt, right? Because the tree comes down, and maybe under a tree before it came down, the sagebrush didn't grow. So you're not really gonna. I'm just guessing here. I'm asking. You're not gonna know until. Are you not gonna know until the plant has grown to a fuller? And I don't even know how long that takes but do you see what I'm asking? I'm just kind of wondering about this, how long it takes for you to really know if it worked, because the sage gotta grow back. I don't know.
This might have been the picture you were thinking of, and that's the chaining.
It was yet another one, but that's okay. I just,
this one on the right.
no, it just had little spots of dirt. You know what I mean? So I'm wondering what a sage grouse, like I would imagine a sage grouse would like a nice big plant to put her nest under. I don't know.
Yes, yes.
So
And
you said you haven't come to any conclusions yet, but I was asking sort of, don't you have to wait until it regrows to, you know what I mean, to a more normal?
yeah, so some of those big sagebrush plants that you're picturing can take decades, or they do take decades to grow to that size. So unfortunately, we don't have that type of scale of monitoring yet, because no one's really asked this question before of what non-target species, like non-game species, could be affected. And the vegetation, it takes a few decades to grow back. And the longest time scale we have is 10 years. So for some of these removal sites, we chose sites that were removed up to 5 years before I started, and then transects that similarly would be removed within my 4 years of monitoring. So we do have a little bit of a time variable there as comparison. But even on the sites that are 10 years old, it's so dry here, the trees are just still dead on the ground. Like they're still on the landscape.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. So you wouldn't really know exactly how it's affecting them because it might take a while to come back. Like if, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you are completely right. Concerns about the scale of these programs is not unfounded and not uncommon. And so that's why we're out there, is to see, is this really a beneficial practice for the rest of the species, at least in the years that we can reasonably manage. If we had more funding, we would continue monitoring longer. And hopefully this will continue at least in some long-term capacity, even if we're not out there at these intensive cycles like we have been the last 4 years. If we can go out and do sporadic monitoring every few years, that would at least give us that, over the next 10, 20 years.
Sure. I don't see anyone else ask any question. I have one other one. I just didn't understand why the reptile was listed as negative for cutting the tree down. You know what I'm trying to say? I was trying to think, why would a skink, I'm just asking, why would it be negative to, why would tree removal be negative?
So the western skinks actually do like it to be a little wetter, so they'll be a little bit looser. So we find them much more often in the woodlands than we do in the sagebrush that has that, dried out kind of soil. And the sagebrush lizard, even though it's called a sagebrush lizard, are really generalists. And so equally, we find them in the wooded habitats. And so just that type of, we were predicting that type of disturbance might affect them, but because they're such a successful generalist, they're one of the few reptiles that we do see in these removal areas. Loaded of them. They're loaded up. The sagebrush lizard loves tree removal. What other questions do we got? And again, if you think of one, feel free to email.
Oh, there's somebody raising a hand.
Oh, go ahead.
I do have a question with regard to the studies that have been conducted. Have you seen any positive return of sage-grouse to areas where trees have been removed for more than 5 years? Or, I mean, are we seeing some positive results with the repopulation of the area?
Yeah, I can't say for the whole of Nevada, but for the areas of northern Modoc County and northern Washoe County that's managed by that Surprise Valley office, there's another researcher from Oregon State, Dr. Christian Hagen, who's been monitoring the sage-grouse populations up there in response to the tree removals. And those are smaller scale lop and scatter, right? So areas where you still have that thick sagebrush understory, but he has seen positive impacts on this to the sage-grouse and their populations, and the amount of habitat they're able to use with those tree removals.
Okay.
Anecdotally, we do in that same region of the state or by the California border, we have flushed sage-grouse out of some of these dead tree piles. So they're there. But they're a quiet species that are breeding earlier in the season than we get out there. So we don't really get them on the recorders as much. But you definitely could record them if you had the detectors out recording earlier in the season.
Okay, so did I hear you right? Did you say that they were actually using the lopped trees as a perhaps nesting site?
I don't know if they were nesting because it's later in the season that we're out there. But we do flush them out of, I'm thinking of a particular transect that we semi-regularly flush them out of. Yeah. But animals are adaptable. And so what's another part of this is we saw that rock red right in the first picture using that dead tree pile. And so we don't know what animals might enjoy these newly created habitats either. Even if it's not part of the ecology we already know.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't know there were any pikas out there in the Great Northern Basin.
Yeah, it's the lowest elevation habitats, across their whole range. They're usually like thought of as alpine species out in Yellowstone, Colorado.
Yeah.
But we
How
have, and then recently started to be studied in depth by some of our collaborators over the last few years, where before they were kind of thought to be extirpated since it's so low elevation in comparison.
And what elevation are you talking about? 5,000?
6,000 feet.
Okay.
Whoa, that is low.
Yeah. But for a pika who could be up at 12,000, there's less thermoregulation available if it starts to get hotter. And hotter.
Yeah.
I asked because they've been
Nowhere
at
higher
pretty
than
low elevations on Lassen National Forest.
in about that same range or
I think so,
higher?
yeah.
Yeah, I've only seen one at Lassen Volcanic National Park.
Did it yell at you?
It was fall and he was collecting his grass in his mouth, his little hay.
Yeah.
I have to say it was darling.
Yeah. We have, so in addition to the acoustics out at those talus sites, we have camera traps facing right into the hay piles, because the question is when we aren't able to get to those habitats because they're really remote and it gets snow covered, which one or what combination of them is best for monitoring their winter activity.
They
And
probably
so
love winter, huh?
yeah, they do. And the interesting thing from our pilot work is that each individual pika is making unique decisions about using the habitat during the winter. So we see some that are coming out when it's thick snowpack and they're active at night. And we see others that are completely inactive. We don't detect at all for months until the snow starts to melt, and then they're active every day. But they're making different types of thermoregulation choices.
Well, this was wonderful. I see in the chat somebody told you it was very fascinating. Yes, thank you so much for coming tonight, and everyone that was here with us. It was very enjoyable and very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for your energy and willingness. And it's very interesting to know all this stuff because, you know what I mean? There's just so much nature everywhere and so much going on and so many little corners of our world. So I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, nice to see
A
everybody.
lot of good information.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good night,
you all for
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. And thanks again, Danielle.
I think Carl
And
said
good luck this summer. If that's the right thing to say, break a leg. I don't know. I don't know what you tell a doctoral candidate, but
All right, do you need anything else from me?
no, No. You take
Right.
care.
You too.
Have a
Bye.
good night, everybody. Good night. Night, Dawn.